It's got a lot of different elements in it. And if you go on their websites, it's clear that what climate justice actually is a kind of bumper sticker that allows for all sorts of people to do a variety of things that they think are appropriate or desirable. And I think it was kind of an inevitable label to come along because everyone had heard of environmental justice and they kind of knew something about that. And the attempt to deal with climate change on a massive basis meant that people would naturally want to find some sort of a rubric whereby they could attach to that enterprise, and so climate justice is a kind of a natural thing. So so what you've got in that movement, then, it seems to me, is a large variety of people doing all kinds of work. Some of them are people who are simply anti-globalization people, the kind of people who were at the Battle of Seattle back in '99 and all of that sort of thing. You've got a fair number of anti-capitalist types running around in there. And I'm sure you also have people doing fairly pragmatic work, and everybody is comfortable because the rubric of climate justice is so broad that it can mean everything to it. It can mean whatever you want it to mean. The big success of environmental justice was in terms of generating a discussion and keeping the issue of inequity alive. If you go back 30, 40 years in environmental policy, there really wasn't much of a racial piece. There wasn't much of a class piece to it. And in fact, there was a lot of hostility between some representatives of minority populations and the environmental movement. The representatives of the civil rights movement and so on thought that the environmental movement really was ignoring this important element, that the real endangered species was young black men in the ghetto. And so climate justice undoubtedly is going to stick around for a period of time. I think there is a similarity in that I doubt that climate justice is going to have much policy bite. I don't think it's going to, there's not going to be a Climate Justice Act of 2012 or 2013. I don't think we're going to see much in the way of policy coming out of it. There may be some policy initiatives inspired by it, but similarly, environmental justice is not something that has led to a whole lot of real policy. In fact, environmental justice has kind of reached a kind of, in a policy sense, a pretty quick dead end, largely because the people who were advocates of environmental justice found that all of the prime seats at the table had already been taken by the large environmental organizations and by corporations and others. But I doubt that bothers the climate justice people very much. They can still do the things that they want to do. They'll do a lot of protest. They went to Copenhagen and they protested, they made a fuss. And that kind of activity will be very engaging for a certain constituency. The other thing is that climate justice, if you're talking about the justice piece of it, there are different theories of justice, and the polluter pays, the beneficiary pays, or we can all pay equally, or pay what you can, or whatever. I don't think there is a coherent view of what justice requires. I think there are lots of different views of what justice requires, but because the bumper sticker is climate justice, everybody is for they can all embrace that, and everybody can be for what they want to be for. What you really want, it seems to me, if you care about justice, is to help poor countries, poor communities, poor people, and if you're going to do that, you really have to do that in a pragmatic way. And I just don't see that kind of pragmatic, I don't see what the pragmatic handle is that you get from what is called climate justice. But I can also see the popularity of the term. If you really want to help poor people, you have to do education, you have to do public health, you have to do things like clean water. You have to be involved in helping poor people, poor communities, poor countries get themselves into a situation where they can help themselves. And that means engaging with the international community. That means, marketing products. That means marketing products within the country. It means having globally competitive exports. It means empowering women. And I'm sure that if you talk to climate justice activists, they'll say that they are for a lot of these things. The problem is that they're for everything, and it's very diffuse, it seems to me. There is a kind of reflexive opposition to anything that's corporate. So, for example, from my point of view, nuclear power makes sense, at least as an interim technology. I don't think climate justice people believe that. Secondly, if we ever get to the point where solar and wind power are viable, which is going to be a long time from now, then it's probably not going to be a kind of solar power industry or wind power industry that's going to make climate justice people happy entirely. The assumption often is that if we're going to have solar power, it's going to be, say, decentralized solar power, that is going to be community-controlled solar power, it's going to be democratic solar power. And frankly, I think the expectations for that kind of democratized enterprise are probably excessive. I think we're going to have, if solar ever gets going, really, I think solar is going to be is likely, after all of the breakups and shakeouts and recombinations and buyouts and so on, will probably end up as some sort of oligopoly. It'll probably, you'll have 3 or 4 at most companies that run the show. They'll be vertically integrated. They'll look a lot like the kind of corporations that we have today. Same thing for wind. There are two ways to approach this. You can either try to convince climate justice people what they should be for. I don't think that's actually going to work. I think the better strategy is to speak to the wider audience about how they should regard the climate justice movement or climate justice as a piece of rhetoric. That's a much more realistic approach, to simply leave the climate justice people to play in their little sandbox and move on with stuff that actually works. But I think that's, and I think that it seems to me that some of the democratic or democratizing aspirations that people have are probably just unrealistic. In fact, we're probably better off, I can't believe I'm saying this in California, Northern California, but we're probably better off with corporate corporate growth focus, even an economic growth focus, than with democratic aspirations that aren't going to really go anywhere. I mean, I think democracy will probably come, but probably only once low-income people, very poor people we're talking about, have gotten enough kind of wind in their sails economically and educationally so that they can make democracy happen the way they want to make it happen. I don't think we're going to make democracy happen in these places.